Hi, and welcome to my series, How Do I BI, a many-part screencast series on using SQL Server Analysis Services 2008, based as a companion to my book, Smart Business Intelligence Solutions with Microsoft SQL Server 2008. I'm Lynn Langen, a developer evangelist for Microsoft based in Southern California. In today's installment, we're going to take a look at creating and using data sources in BIDs. Before we do that, we're going to look at the FAQs and gotchas. In terms of FAQs, all SQL Server Analysis Services projects require a data source, which is in essence a connection string. It's really important that you understand that any installed driver or provider can be used as a data source. A common misconception is that SQL Server relational data is the only source that can be used as a basis for OLAP cubes or data mining models, and that is completely untrue, as we'll see in the screencast. When we're working in BIDs, it's a right-click graphical user interface environment, but it's actually generating XMLA metadata. And this is convenient when you're moving from development to production and in other scenarios in terms such as backup, because you can replicate connections and other objects that you create in BIDs via XMLA scripts. We won't be covering scripts in this screencast, but we will in a future one. In terms of implementing a data source in BIDs, some gotchas are you want to use appropriate security. For purposes of demonstration, we'll just be using an administrator account on the machine, and that may or may not be appropriate for your particular security requirements. And it is important that you understand that only members of the OLAP administrators group on the machine where SSAS is installed can connect by default to SSAS objects. You can change the security by using SSAS roles, which we'll again talk about in a future screencast. Before we go to that, I want to highlight yet another BI community expert as a resource for you as you're learning. His name is Sahil Malik, and he's a SQL Server MVP. He also was a contributor to the book that was referenced earlier. And now we'll go to the screencast. We'll be taking a look at the data source object in SQL Server Analysis Services as it's implemented in BIDs. So what I have here is the sample project called AdventureWorks DW that is opened in BIDs, and I've shown how to connect in previous screencasts. In this screencast, we're going to take a look at the data source object itself that exists, as well as creating a new one. So to examine any existing data sources, you just click on the container and then click on the named data source and then double click it, and that'll open up some dialog boxes. So you can see what the name is, and you can see that the connection string is, if we go ahead and click edit, set to the native OLEDB SQL Server native client 10 and to localhost, connecting with Windows authentication to the AdventureWorks DW sample database. It's very important if you are connecting to SQL Server that you use the SQL Server native client provider so that you can take advantage of all the functionality that's available within SQL Server rather than simply defaulting back to sort of general relational database capabilities. You'll notice that some of these features are shown on the Data Source Designer dialog box in the isolation section. For example, the default is read committed, but do note that you have the option to read a snapshot, and the reason that you might want to do that is to reduce overhead against your production database and to read actually from a snapshotted copy. You have a query timeout, a maximum number of connections, and data source description options on this page. On the second tab of the Data Source Designer, you have impersonation information, and it's very important that you document and implement your security requirements for your particular solution. You can see that for this particular connection, we've set up to use the service account, which we covered in a previous screencast, is the account that you've associated with the SSAS service itself. Other options are to use a specific Windows username and password, to use the credentials of the current user, or to inherit. And I'm going to go ahead and click cancel out of here. If we wanted to make an additional data source for this analysis services project, which includes data as sources for both cubes and data mining models, there is not a capability to create a data source for data mining models only or cubes only. It's for both. We would simply right click and then click on New Data Source, and that would open up the data source wizard. As we work our way through BIDs, you'll see that this is a familiar design paradigm that will occur over and over. And the wizards are deceptively simple. When you take a look at them, you're going to want to spend the time to read all the information and to complete the options in the dialog boxes. It's going to help you to create the appropriate objects. Now in the course of data sources is probably the simplest thing that you're going to do, so we can go pretty quickly through this. We're going to click Next, and we could select an existing data source, and these are data sources that have been predefined in other BIDS projects on this particular machine. What we're going to do is create a new data source. And the reason we're going to do that is so that you can understand and see all the various providers that are available. As I mentioned in the gotchas portion of the screencast, it is very, very important that you understand that analysis services can be used with data sources that are listed in this list and not just SQL Server. So for example, we've got the ability to connect to Oracle, we've got the ability to connect to JET, which is Access, and some other really interesting choices like Microsoft Directory Services, which is actually the Active Directory. If you are looking for a provider and it's not available here, you might want to first check Codeplex, www.codeplex.com, to see if one has been made available there. Or if that's not available and you have a proprietary source database, you might want to check with your database vendor to see if there's any intent to create a provider, because you will need a provider that's as specific as possible for your particular database. And as we work through the series, you'll understand why this is important. Then once you select your provider, you go ahead and select your server name. The quickest way to do it, if your source data is on the same machine, which is usually only the situation for testing, generally you're going to have two separate machines in production, is just to put a dot, which indicates localhost. And then you select either Windows or SQL Server Authentication. When you click the drop down on the Connect to Database, then all the databases that are available will be enumerated. It's very important that you pick the appropriate edition from the samples. The source databases are in two formats. AdventureWorks Standard, or 2008, is in a relational format, and that is not what is expected when you are going to implement OLAP cubes in particular. Now, data mining models actually can be built off of straight relational sources or sources that have been modeled in what's called a star schema, and that's how AdventureWorks DW is modeled. So we're going to select that. We're going to test the connection. We're going to see that our connection succeeded, and then click OK to add it. So it's really just as simple as that to add data sources in analysis services.